Imagine a world where every sunrise brought the threat of loss, where your body was never truly your own, and where the simplest act of feeding your child was a heroic feat. What if the most natural human experience, motherhood, was fraught with unimaginable dangers and burdens? In the year 970 AD, how did mothers not only survive, but nurture life amidst constant peril? Number 1. The social and emotional isolation. In the year 970 AD, the world was vast and interconnected, yet for many mothers it was also incredibly small and profoundly isolating. While communities were often tight-knit, bound by shared struggles and common ancestry, the specific burdens of motherhood could cast a long shadow of loneliness. Imagine a young woman, perhaps barely into her teenage years, having just given birth for the first time. Her own mother or older female relatives might be nearby, offering guidance rooted in centuries of tradition, but the emotional landscape of her new role was often a solitary journey. There were no mothers' groups, no online forums to commiserate about sleepless nights or the overwhelming demands of a newborn. A mother's primary social sphere was often limited to her immediate household and a handful of close female kin or neighbors. If she lived in a remote village or a secluded farmstead, her interactions might be even more restricted, confined almost entirely to her family and the demands of agricultural life. For women in rural settings, which comprised the vast majority of the population, daily life was dictated by the rhythms of the land and the needs of the household. Their labor was constant from dawn until dusk, leaving little time for leisure or social calls that were not directly tied to communal work. A mother might spend her entire day grinding grain, spinning wool, tending to livestock, and preparing food, all while simultaneously caring for infants and young children. This relentless physical exertion, often performed alone or with only the company of her children, meant that opportunities for meaningful adult conversation or emotional support were scarce. Historical accounts suggest that women primarily interacted within their gendered roles, sharing knowledge about childcare, herbal remedies, and domestic tasks. But these interactions were often pragmatic rather than deeply emotionally supportive in the modern sense. The emotional toll of constant vigilance for a child's health, coupled with the ever-present threat of disease or famine, could lead to profound internal struggles without an external outlet for processing grief or fear. Furthermore, the very concept of individual emotional well-being as a distinct and pronatized aspect of life was far removed from the concerns of 10th century society. Survival was paramount. Expressions of overwhelming sadness or anxiety, while undoubtedly felt, might have been viewed as a luxury or even as a weakness in a world where resilience was a fundamental requirement for existence. There was no professional class of counselors or therapists to offer a listening ear. One's closest confidant was often a sister, a mother, or perhaps a particularly trusted neighbor. But even these relationships were constrained by the pervasive societal norms and the demands of daily life. The shared understanding of suffering was implicit, a part of the communal fabric, but direct, open conversations about personal emotional distress were likely less common than they are today. The weight of private anxieties, whether concerning a child's fever, a meager harvest, or the dangers of childbirth, was often carried silently. For women in more affluent or aristocratic households, the isolation might manifest differently. While they might have more servants to assist with physical labor, they were often confined to their domains, their social interactions dictated by strict protocols and the strategic alliances of their families. A noblewoman might be sent to a foreign land for marriage, far from her birth family and familiar customs, thrust into an alien household where she was expected to produce heirs. Her personal feelings were often secondary to the political and economic imperatives of her union. Though she might have a retinue of ladies-in-waiting, these relationships were often hierarchical and formal, not necessarily conduits for deep emotional sharing. The intense pressure to produce a male heir, the public scrutiny of her fertility, and the often distant relationship with her husband could create a profound sense of loneliness, even amidst a bustling court or castle. Historians suggest that for many noble women, their children, particularly their sons, were their primary source of emotional connection and purpose, making the constant threat of child mortality all the more devastating and isolating when it struck. Moreover, the spiritual framework of the time, while offering comfort and hope, could also inadvertently contribute to a sense of isolation. While communal worship was central to life, personal struggles were often viewed through the lens of divine will or sin. A mother struggling with an illness in her child might turn to prayer and local saints, but the overwhelming sense of individual responsibility for one's actions and fate, even if mediated by faith, could feel immense. The idea of community support was more about practical assistance, like helping with a harvest or sharing a meal in times of scarcity, rather than a structured system for psychological well-being. A mother was expected to be strong, stoic, and enduring, embodying the virtues of resilience essential for the survival of her family and community. This expectation, while a source of strength, could also create a barrier to revealing vulnerability or seeking emotional solace in a profound way. The emotional journey of motherhood in 970 odd was for many a deeply personal and often solitary endurance test, navigated without the social and psychological safety nets that modern societies strive to provide. Number 2. The absence of medical knowledge and care. In 970 AD, the concept of modern medicine, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There were no hospitals equipped with sterile instruments and life-saving drugs. There were no trained physicians with a comprehensive understanding of anatomy, physiology, or germ theory. For a mother facing the countless ailments that threatened her children and herself, her primary recourse was often limited to a blend of traditional folk remedies, inherited wisdom, and fervent prayer. This profound absence of effective medical knowledge meant that even common illnesses could quickly escalate into fatal conditions, turning motherhood into a constant, terrifying gamble against unseen forces. Consider a child afflicted with a high fever and a persistent cough. Today, parents would seek a doctor who might diagnose pneumonia or influenza, prescribe antibiotics or antiviral medication, and monitor the child's progress. In 970, a mother would observe the symptoms with growing dread. Her attempts to alleviate the suffering might include administering herbal concoctions passed down through generations, perhaps a decoction of willow bark for fever or a poultice of specific leaves for congestion. She might rely on the advice of an elderly woman in the village, perhaps a midwife or a wise woman, who had accumulated a lifetime of practical experience, albeit without any scientific understanding of disease. These remedies, while sometimes offering symptomatic relief, could not address the underlying bacterial or viral infections that ravaged fragile young bodies. Scholars of the period have documented various herbals in medical texts, but these were often rudimentary, steeped in humoral theory, and accessible only to a select few, typically monastic scholars or courtly physicians whose knowledge was far removed from the everyday struggles of the common mother. The sheer scale of ignorance about basic hygiene and disease transmission was a major factor. The concept of microscopic pathogens was millennia away. People lived in close proximity to their livestock. Waste was often disposed of indiscriminately, and clean water was a precious, often contaminated commodity. A child suffering from dysentery, a common and deadly affliction, would experience severe dehydration. A mother might offer clean water, if available, but without an understanding of electrolyte imbalance or rehydration therapy, the child's decline was often swift and inevitable. The lack of knowledge about proper sanitation meant that illnesses spread like wildfire through villages and households, turning single cases into devastating epidemics that wiped out entire families. Mothers watched helplessly as their children succumbed to ailments that are now easily preventable or treatable, like measles, whooping cough, or even a simple infected cut. Beyond common illnesses, the understanding of complex medical conditions was virtually non-existent. Congenital defects, neurological disorders, or chronic diseases were often attributed to spiritual causes, such as curses, the wrath of God, or the influence of malevolent spirits. A child born with a severe physical disability might be seen as a burden, a sign of divine displeasure, or even as an elf shot, a child taken by fairies and replaced with a changeling. This supernatural interpretation, while offering a framework for understanding the inexplicable, also meant that there was no attempt at medical intervention or supportive care beyond what rudimentary compassion allowed. Mothers often carried the enormous emotional and physical burden of caring for such children with no hope of a medical solution, relying solely on faith and community tolerance. Even for the most common and dangerous events, such as injuries or childbirth, medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. A broken bone might be splinted with sticks, often leading to improper healing and lifelong disability. A deep wound could easily become infected, leading to sepsis and death, as there was no understanding of antisepsis or antibiotics. For mothers, enduring their own frequent pregnancies and childbirths was an extreme test of survival, as explored in a previous section. Without trained obstetricians, without sterile environments, without pain, relief beyond what natural resilience offered, maternal mortality was horrifyingly high. A mother might successfully deliver a child only to succumb to postpartum hemorrhage or puerperal fever, leaving her newborn an orphan and her other children motherless. The pervasive shadow of death, cast by a world without medical understanding, was a constant companion for mothers in 970, and shaping every aspect of their lives and infusing every child's cry or cough with a deep existential dread. Number 3. The brutal exposure to the elements. Imagine living in a world where the weather wasn't just an inconvenience, but a constant, life-threatening adversary. For mothers, in 970, the brutal exposure to the elements was not a temporary discomfort, but a fundamental aspect of their daily existence, impacting every decision, every task, and every moment of caring for their children. Their homes, often rudimentary structures of wood, wattle and daub or stone, offered little protection against the harsh realities of nature, and the necessities of life often forced them outdoors, regardless of the conditions. Winter was a season of profound dread. Without modern heating systems, homes were damp, drafty, and perpetually cold. A mother would spend countless hours tending a small, inefficient fire in the hearth, often fueled by scavenged wood or peat, just to keep the chill at bay. The smoke, without proper ventilation, filled the living space, contributing to respiratory ailments for both adults and children. Keeping infants and young children warm was a monumental challenge. Swaddling clothes, wool blankets, and huddling together for warmth were essential strategies, but frostbite, hypothermia, and winter coughs that quickly escalated into pneumonia were ever-present dangers. Imagine trying to lull a crying baby to sleep in a dwelling where your breath visibly plumed in the frigid air and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls. The chronic dampness also contributed to various illnesses, from persistent colds to more severe rheumatic conditions, impacting a mother's ability to perform her demanding physical labor. Historical records from the period often describe the extreme measures people took to survive harsh winters, including burning precious resources and huddling with livestock for warmth, illustrating the desperate struggle against the cold. Summer, while offering a respite from the biting cold, brought its own set of challenges. Scorching heat waves, particularly in more southern regions, could lead to heat stroke and dehydration, especially for young children and infants who are more susceptible. The lack of clean, cool water was a perpetual problem, making hydration a constant concern. Furthermore, summer brought an explosion of insects, flies, mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas, which were not just annoying, but carriers of disease. Mosquitoes spread malaria, Ticks carried Lyme disease-like infections, and flies contaminated food and open wounds. A mother had no repellents, no screens on windows, no understanding of how these tiny creatures could transmit deadly illnesses. Her children, playing outdoors in the fields or by the stream, were constantly exposed, and she could only watch for symptoms, helpless against the invisible threat. Beyond the direct impact of temperature, the elements dictated the very availability of food and resources. A late spring frost could devastate crops, leading to famine. A prolonged drought could wither fields and dry up water sources. Heavy rains could flood rivers, destroying homes and washing away precious topsoil, leading to starvation. A mother's ability to feed her children was entirely at the mercy of the weather. She had to understand the rhythms of the seasons, the nuances of the local climate, and make critical decisions about planting, harvesting, and storing food, all while simultaneously caring for her family. If a harvest failed due to unseasonable weather, the hunger pains would be felt first and most acutely by the most vulnerable members of the household, the young children and their nursing mothers. Anthropological studies of pre-industrial societies consistently highlight the intimate and often precarious relationship between human survival and climatic conditions, a reality that bore down heavily on mothers responsible for sustenance. Even everyday tasks involved significant exposure. Gathering firewood, fetching water from a distant well or stream, working in the fields, or tending livestock. All these essential chores had to be performed outdoors, regardless of rain, snow, sun, or wind. Imagine a mother with a baby strapped to her back, trudging through mud or snow to collect water from a half-frozen stream, her hands numb with cold, her body aching from the effort. Or consider her working in a scorching field, hoeing or harvesting, with the sun beating down, her skin parched and cracked. There were no waterproof jackets, no insulated boots, no breathable fabrics designed for comfort. Clothing was made from coarse wool or linen, offering limited protection. The constant exposure to the elements took a severe physical toll, contributing to chronic pain, early aging, and susceptibility to illness. For mothers in 970, the world outside their flimsy walls was a relentless, often hostile environment, demanding a resilience that is almost unfathomable in our temperature-controlled, climate-controlled lives. Number 4. The lack of modern hygiene and sanitation. Imagine a world devoid of soap as we know it, where clean running water was a luxury found only in natural springs or painstakingly drawn from wells, and where waste disposal was often a simple matter of throwing it out the door. For mothers in 970, the lack of modern hygiene and sanitation was not merely an inconvenience, but a constant, pervasive threat to the health and survival of their children and themselves. This fundamental absence of cleanliness directly contributed to the spread of disease, creating a perilous environment where every cut, every meal, and every breath could be a vector for illness. Consider the daily challenges of personal hygiene. Regular bathing, especially with warm water, was a rare event for most, typically reserved for specific occasions or for those with access to communal bathhouses, which were not universally available and certainly not a daily ritual. For common folk, washing was often limited to a quick scrub with cold water, perhaps a little ash for an abrasive, and certainly no understanding of antibacterial properties. Clothes were not washed frequently, especially in winter, when water was scarce and drying was difficult. They accumulated dirt, sweat, and parasites. Imagine a mother trying to keep her children clean when her own hands, used for cooking, cleaning, and caring for livestock, were often contaminated. The idea of washing hands before preparing food or after handling human waste simply did not exist in the scientific sense, leading to rampant transmission of bacteria and viruses. Children, naturally prone to putting things in their mouths and playing in dirty environments, were especially vulnerable. Historians studying medieval domestic life frequently point to the widespread presence of fleas, lice, and other parasites as an accepted part of daily existence, indicating the low standards of personal hygiene. The conditions within homes were equally challenging. Dirt floors were common, accumulating dust, food scraps, and animal waste. Animal dung was often used as fuel or fertilizer, bringing it into close proximity with living spaces. Pest control was rudimentary. Rats, mice, and insects roamed freely, contaminating food supplies and spreading disease. Food preparation was often done without the benefit of refrigeration, leading to rapid spoilage, especially in warmer months. Meat was salted or smoked, but fresh produce spoiled quickly. A mother would have to be incredibly vigilant, relying on traditional knowledge and her senses to detect spoilage. But even so, foodborne illnesses were a constant danger. Cooking often involved open fires which, while providing warmth, also produced smoke that filled the home, contributing to respiratory problems for everyone, particularly young children whose lungs were still developing. Perhaps the most critical issue was sanitation. Human and animal waste was often disposed of in ways that directly contaminated water sources or living areas. Outhouses or privies, if they existed at all, were often poorly maintained and far from hygienic. In densely populated areas, waste was simply thrown into streets or into open pits, becoming breeding grounds for flies and rats, which then carried pathogens directly into homes and onto food. Wells, the primary source of drinking water, were frequently contaminated by runoff from these unsanitary conditions. A mother fetching water for her family, unaware of the invisible dangers lurking within it, was unknowingly bringing the source of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery into her home. These waterborne diseases were rampant and devastating, particularly for infants and toddlers whose immune systems were still developing. Accounts from monastic chronicles and early urban records frequently describe widespread outbreaks of flux or bloody flux, euphemisms for dysentery, which decimated populations, hitting the youngest and weakest the hardest. The lack of understanding about the link between hygiene and disease meant that even the most well-intentioned efforts could be ineffective or counterproductive. A mother might wash her children's faces with water from a contaminated well, or apply a poultice to a wound with unwashed hands, unknowingly exacerbating the very problem she sought to solve. The environment itself was a breeding ground for pathogens, crowded living conditions, close contact with animals, unsanitary waste disposal, and contaminated food and water. For mothers in 970, keeping their children healthy was an uphill battle against a constant barrage of invisible enemies, a fight waged without the most basic weapons of modern sanitation and hygiene, making every day a precarious dance with sickness and death. Number 5. The pervasive threat of disease and illness. Imagine waking up each morning to the terrifying knowledge that an invisible enemy could strike down your child at any moment, swiftly and without warning. In 970, for mothers, the pervasive threat of disease and illness was not an abstract concept, but a relentless, tangible reality that shaped every aspect of their lives and cast a long shadow over every joyous moment. Without vaccines, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of germ theory, disease was a mysterious, often fatal force that stalked every household, particularly preying on the most vulnerable infants and young children. Common childhood illnesses that we now consider mild and manageable were often death sentences. Measles, mumps, chickenpox, and rubella, which today might mean a few days of discomfort, could lead to severe complications like pneumonia, encephalitis, or permanent disability, and frequently, death. Imagine the heartbreak of watching your child covered in a rash, feverish, and gasping for breath, knowing there was nothing you could do but offer comfort and pray. Whooping cough, with its characteristic, suffocating fits of coughing, would leave infants utterly exhausted, unable to feed, and susceptible to deadly secondary infections. Historical demographers, analyzing grave sites and population data from the period, have consistently shown that a significant proportion of deaths occurred in childhood, often before the age of 5, with infectious diseases being the primary culprits. Beyond these common childhood ailments, the world of 970 AD was ravaged by epidemics that could wipe out entire families and communities. Dysentery, often referred to as the bloody flux, spread rapidly through contaminated water and poor sanitation, leading to severe dehydration and death, especially in infants and toddlers. Cholera, though perhaps less widespread than in later centuries, would have also been a terrifying and swift killer where it occurred. Typhoid fever, spread by contaminated food and water, caused high fevers, weakness, and internal bleeding. These illnesses, now largely controlled by modern sanitation and medicine, were unavoidable facts of life then. A single case could quickly become an outbreak, turning a thriving village into a ghost town. Mothers were on constant, heightened alert. Every cough, every fever, every instance of diarrhea, a cause for extreme alarm. Malaria, often prevalent in swampy or warm regions, added another layer of danger. Recurring bouts of fever and chills would debilitate adults and children alike, weakening their immune systems and making them more susceptible to other infections. Nutritional deficiencies, endemic due to unreliable food supplies and limited dietary diversity, further compounded the problem. A child weakened by malnutrition was far less likely to survive even a mild infection. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin, etc., and rickets from vitamin D deficiency were common, leading to weakened bodies and increased vulnerability to disease. Combination of poor nutrition and a constant barrage of pathogens created a vicious cycle of illness and decline. Historical records, such as monastic infirmary lists or chronicles detailing periods of plague, frequently mention the widespread suffering from these debilitating conditions. Compounding these threats was the sheer lack of medical understanding and care. As discussed, there were no antibiotics to fight bacterial infections, no antivirals for viruses, no vaccines for prevention. Folk remedies and superstitions, while perhaps offering psychological comfort, did little to stem the tide of serious illness. A mother would try compresses, herbal teas, or even ritualistic practices, but the effectiveness against serious infections was negligible. The absence of trained medical professionals meant that even critical interventions like setting a broken bone or cleaning a deep wound were often performed by laypersons, with high risks of infection and complications. For a mother, seeing her child suffer was a profound agony, knowing that her best efforts were often insufficient against the overwhelming power of disease. Pervasive threat of illness was not just a burden. It was the ultimate constant companion of motherhood in 970, and a terrifying specter that haunted every lullaby and every embrace, reminding her of the fragility of life. Number 6. The weight of frequent pregnancies. Imagine a life where your body was almost constantly in a state of pregnancy or recovering from it, where the decision to have children was not a conscious choice, but an inevitable biological imperative, and where the respite between one birth and the next was often just a few months. For mothers in 970, the weight of frequent pregnancies was an exhausting, physically draining, and often perilous reality, shaping their entire adult lives and leaving little time for their bodies to recover or their spirits to rest. Without any form of reliable contraception, fertility was largely unmanaged. While mesting could offer some degree of natural birth control, it was not foolproof, and many mothers would find themselves pregnant again within a year or two of giving birth. Marriage typically occurred young, often in the mid to late teens for women, and the expectation was to produce as many children as possible, particularly sons, to ensure the family's survival, labor force, and legacy. A woman could expect to be pregnant numerous times throughout her childbearing years, potentially enduring 10 or more pregnancies, each a profound physical ordeal. Historians and archaeologists studying skeletal remains from this period often find evidence of high parity in women, indicating numerous pregnancies which left distinct marks on their bones. Each pregnancy brought its own set of challenges, often without adequate nutrition or rest. Malnutrition was common even in times of plenty, as understanding of balanced diets was limited. A pregnant woman might suffer from severe morning sickness, iron deficiency, anemia, or various other ailments, all while continuing to perform strenuous daily labor. Imagine the profound fatigue of carrying a child while grinding grain, spinning wool, tending to livestock, or working in the fields. There was no concept of maternity leave, no reduced workload. Pregnant mother worked until the very last moment, and often resumed her duties mere days after childbirth. The nutritional demands of pregnancy, followed by the equally demanding process of mething, would steadily deplete a woman's body, leaving her vulnerable to illness and general debilitation. The risks inherent in childbirth itself were astronomical, as discussed in a previous section. Each pregnancy was a roll of the dice, not just for the infant, but for the mother too. Maternal mortality rates were shockingly high, with deaths from hemorrhage, infection, or prolonged labor being tragically common. Surviving one birth did not guarantee survival of the next. For a woman, the experience of having already lost several children and knowing the mortal dangers of giving birth would have added an immense psychological burden to each subsequent pregnancy. The cycle was relentless. Conception, pregnancy, the ordeal of childbirth, the joys and immense labor of caring for a newborn, often followed by another conception before the body had fully recovered, and often alongside the grief of recent loss. The cumulative toll on a woman's body was immense. Repeated pregnancies, often in close succession, would stretch and weaken muscles, organs, and bones. Conditions like prolapse, chronic pain, and permanent physical changes were common. Imagine a woman perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s already having gone through 5 or more pregnancies, her body aching, her energy perpetually depleted, yet still facing the prospect of many more years of childbearing. Her physical appearance would age prematurely, reflecting the relentless demands placed upon her. This was not a choice. It was the biological imperative of the age, driven by high infant mortality rates and the need for labor. Every child born represented not only a new life, but also a further depletion of the mother's own dwindling reserves. Furthermore, the constant presence of young children demanding feeding, cleaning, and attention, while simultaneously being pregnant, created an almost unimaginable logistical and emotional burden. A mother might be nursing a toddler while feeling the kicks of a new baby within her, all while trying to prepare a meal or mend clothes. There was little opportunity for self-care or personal space. The weight of frequent pregnancies was thus a multifaceted challenge, a relentless physical drain, a constant threat to life, a profound psychological burden, and an ever-present reminder of the societal expectations that dictated a woman's primary role was that of a childbearer, often at great personal cost to her own health and well-being. Number 7. The scarcity and struggle for food. Imagine a life where hunger was a familiar ache, where every meal was a testament to arduous labor and precarious luck, and where the fear of an empty larder was a constant gnawing anxiety. For mothers in 970, the scarcity and struggle for food was not an occasional inconvenience, but a fundamental life-defining challenge that shaped every decision and every day. Providing sustenance for her children was a mother's primary, unrelenting battle, waged against unpredictable harvests, harsh weather, and often the simple limitations of agricultural technology. Most families in 970 lived on the brink of subsistence. Their diets were largely dictated by what could be grown locally. Grains like barley, rye, or oats formed the staple, supplemented by peas, beans, and whatever vegetables could be cultivated or foraged. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for feast days or for the wealthy, and dairy products were seasonal. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, food spoilage was a major problem, especially in warmer months. A mother spent a significant portion of her day preparing food, grinding grain into flour, kneading dough for bread, simmering stews over an open fire. This was labor-intensive, often done with rudimentary tools and always with the knowledge that even the best efforts could be undone by a spoiled batch or an unexpected shortage. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlements often reveals dietary deficiencies in the skeletal remains, indicating chronic undernourishment. The greatest challenge to food security was the unpredictable nature of the harvest. A severe drought could wither crops in the fields, a prolonged flood could wash them away, or an unseasonable frost could kill seedlings. Pests like locusts or rodents could devastate a year's yield in days when a harvest failed. Famine was the inevitable consequence. These were not rare events. Historical chronicles are replete with accounts of devastating famines that swept across regions, decimating populations. During such times, a mother faced an unimaginable ordeal. Watching her children grow weak from hunger, their cries for food echoing her own empty stomach, she would stretch meager rations, forage for wild edibles, beg or even resort to desperate measures, all to keep her children alive. The choices were agonizing. Who gets the last piece of bread? How long can we survive on roots and berries? Even in times of relative plenty, nutritional deficiencies were common. Diets often lacked essential vitamins and minerals, leading to chronic health problems. Anemia caused by iron deficiency was widespread, particularly among women due to frequent pregnancies and menstruation. Scurvy, from a lack of vitamins, etc. And rickets from vitamin deficiency, weakened bones and bodies making children more susceptible to illness. A mother might offer her children the most nutritious foods available to her, perhaps a little milk or a few eggs if they had chickens. But her knowledge of balanced nutrition was limited to generations of inherited wisdom, not scientific understanding. She would prioritize feeding her children over herself, often sacrificing her own health to ensure their survival. Records from monastic granges and manorial accounts often detail the quantities of grain and other foodstuffs produced, highlighting the narrow margins upon which medieval life depended. The struggle for food extended beyond cultivation. Foraging for wild food like berries, nuts, mushrooms, and herbs was a vital time-consuming activity, particularly for women and children. Hunting and fishing, if possible, were also crucial, though often reserved for men or limited by local customs and land ownership. Firewood for cooking and warmth was also a constant need, requiring endless hours of gathering in forests or open fields. Every resource, from water to fuel to food, had to be acquired through relentless effort and often shared among a large household. The absence of modern transportation and trade networks meant that if a region suffered a poor harvest, there was little external support to be found. Communities were largely self-sufficient, and their survival depended entirely on the immediate environment and their own tireless labor. For mothers in 970, the scarcity and struggle for food was not merely a burden. It was the very essence of their fight for their family's survival, a fight that often ended in heartbreak. Number 8. The endless grind of daily labor. Imagine a life where every single aspect of survival, from the food you eat to the clothes on your back, depended on your own raw physical effort from dawn until dusk, day after day, year after year. For mothers in 970, the endless grind of daily labor was not just a part of their lives. It was their lives, a relentless cycle of demanding physical tasks that left little room for rest, leisure, or personal pursuits, all while simultaneously caring for infants and young children. A Mother's Day began before sunrise. The first tasks would involve tending to the fire, preparing a rudimentary breakfast, and beginning the day's chores. For rural women, who comprised the vast majority of the population, This meant a dizzying array of physically demanding tasks. She would be responsible for grinding grain, often by hand, using heavy millstones, a process that was slow, arduous, and repetitive. She would knead dough and bake bread, often in a communal oven or over her own hearth. She would spin wool into yarn and weave it into cloth, a meticulous and time-consuming process that was essential for producing clothing and blankets for her family. Records of peasant life from the early medieval period consistently emphasize the sheer volume of labor required to sustain a household. Beyond these domestic crafts, a mother's labor extended far beyond the home. She was an integral part of agricultural production. Depending on the season and the family's land, she might be involved in planting, weeding, hoeing, and harvesting crops in the fields. Imagine her with a baby strapped to her back, or a toddler clinging to her skirts, bending over rows of crops under a scorching sun or in biting wind, her hands calloused and aching. She would also be responsible for tending to the kitchen garden, which provided vital vegetables and herbs. Livestock care also fell within her purview. Milking cows or goats, collecting eggs from chickens, and processing animal products. This was not a division of labor where women stayed indoors. Their physical contributions to the family's survival were immense and indispensable, often equaling or exceeding that of men in certain periods or regions. Fetching water and gathering firewood were constant, grueling chores. Water had to be carried often from a distant well or stream in heavy buckets or pitchers. Firewood, essential for cooking and warmth, required hours of searching, cutting, and hauling from the woods. These tasks were not occasional but daily necessities, irrespective of weather or physical condition, including pregnancy or postpartum recovery. Imagine a mother, perhaps just weeks after childbirth, still recovering from the immense physical trauma, having to carry heavy loads of water or wood for miles. There were no pumps, no delivery services, no automatic heating. Every calorie of warmth, every drop of water, every bite of food was the direct result of her own sweat and muscle. The sheer volume of work meant that personal time, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There was no concept of a weekend or a day off. Work ceased only for sleep, for religious observance, or for dire illness. A mother's responsibilities stretched late into the evening after her children were asleep, as she might still be patching clothes, preparing food for the next day, or sorting through provisions. The physical toll of this endless grind was immense, leading to chronic fatigue, musculoskeletal pain, and early aging. Women's bodies were perpetually worn down by the demands placed upon them, and injuries or illnesses that would be considered minor today could be debilitating or even fatal in a context where there was no opportunity for extended rest or recuperation. The expectation was simply to endure, to keep going, for the survival of the family depended on it. For mothers in 970, that life was a continuous, physically punishing marathon, and there was no finish line. Number 9. The terrifying reality of childbirth. Imagine facing the most profound physiological event of your life, an event that carries a real and significant chance of death, with no medical intervention, no pain relief, and often little more than folk wisdom to guide you. For mothers in 970, the terrifying reality of childbirth was arguably the single most dangerous and traumatic experience they would face, a brutal rite of passage that frequently claimed lives and left survivors forever chained. Maternal mortality rates in the 10th century were astronomically high by modern standards. Historians estimate that perhaps 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 pregnancies resulted in the mother's death, though precise data is scarce. This meant that a woman entering her childbearing years knew, implicitly or explicitly, that each pregnancy might be her last. The leading causes of maternal death were hemorrhage, infection, and prolonged or obstructed labor. There was no understanding of blood typing or transfusions for severe bleeding. There were no antibiotics to combat the infections that often followed childbirth, whether from unsterile instruments or the unsanitary conditions of the birth environment. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection of the reproductive tract, was a rampant killer, often striking mothers days or weeks after a seemingly successful delivery, leaving them with high fevers and agonizing pain. Accounts from chronicles and early medical texts, though rudimentary, often describe women succumbing to childbed fever, highlighting its prevalence. Childbirth typically took place in the home, often in a dark, cramped space, perhaps with a straw bed on the floor. While sometimes attended by other women, a mother, a sister, or a local midwife, these attendants had no formal medical training. Their knowledge was based on generations of experience, passed down orally, sometimes mixed with superstition. They understood positioning, perhaps rudimentary massage, and could offer moral support, but they had no tools for intervention if complications arose. If a baby was breech or too large, or if the mother experienced a constricted pelvis, there was little that could be done. Prolonged labor could lead to exhaustion, uterine rupture, or fetal distress, ultimately resulting in the death of both mother and child. There was no concept of a cesarean section as a life-saving measure for the mother. If performed, it was typically done post-mortem to save the infant. The pain of childbirth was immense and unrelieved. There were no epidurals, no painkillers, no nitrous oxide. A mother had to endure hours, sometimes days, of excruciating contractions with sheer fortitude. The only respite might come from herbal teas meant to soothe, or from the simple physical support of women holding her. The emotional and psychological trauma of such an experience, coupled with the ever-present threat of death for both herself and her baby, would be profound. Imagine the fear of losing your life while giving life, the agonizing uncertainty of whether you would survive to hold your child or whether your child would even survive the birth itself. Beyond the immediate dangers, childbirth often left mothers with lasting injuries and health complications. Tears and ruptures were common, often leading to chronic pain, incontinence, or uterine prolapse, conditions that would be untreatable and profoundly impact a woman's quality of life. Without proper postnatal care, infections of tears or episiotomies, if performed, were common, leading to further suffering and risk. The physical recovery from childbirth, which today might involve weeks of rest and professional medical checkups, was expected to be swift. A mother was often back to her strenuous daily labor within days of giving birth, compounding her physical ailments and hindering her recovery. Archaeological studies of female skeletons from the period often show evidence of pelvic trauma and other bone changes consistent with numerous difficult births. For women in 970, a childbirth was not merely a natural event, it was a fearsome ordeal, a testament to incredible resilience, and a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Every cry of a newborn was a dual victory, the arrival of a new life and the miraculous survival of the mother who brought it forth, a triumph against overwhelming odds in a world devoid of medical safety nets. Number 10. The constant shadow of infant mortality. Imagine a life where the arrival of a new baby, a moment that should be filled with unbridled joy, was instead tinged with a pervasive, agonizing dread. For mothers in 970, at the constant shadow of infant mortality was perhaps the most brutal and defining aspect of their experience. A heartbreaker reality that meant perhaps 1 in 3 or even 1 in 2 of their precious newborns would not survive to see their first birthday. This was not a rare tragedy. It was the norm, a relentless statistic that shaped every hope, every bond, and every moment of parenthood. The sheer scale of infant death is almost incomprehensible in modern times. While exact figures are difficult to ascertain due to limited record keeping, Historical demographers and archaeologists studying pre-industrial populations consistently point to shockingly high rates of infant and child mortality. Estimates suggest that between 30% and 50% of children died before the age of 5, with the majority of those deaths occurring in the first year of life. Imagine dedicating your body, your energy, and your love to bringing a new life into the world, only to have that life extinguished by unseen forces, a fever, a cough, a little diarrhea within a matter of weeks or months. This was the lived reality for mothers in 970 AD. Poor nutrition for both mother and child meant weakened immune systems. Contaminated water and food led to rampant diarrheal diseases, which quickly dehydrated and killed infants. Lack of basic hygiene meant infection spread like wildfire. Respiratory infections, from common colds to pneumonia, were deadly without antibiotics. Childhood diseases like measles, whooping cough, and smallpox, now largely preventable by vaccination, swept through communities indiscriminately, claiming the youngest and most vulnerable. There was no scientific understanding of how these illnesses spread, no vaccines and no effective treatments. A mother would watch helplessly as her infant succumbed, often with little more than traditional remedies and desperate prayers as her tools against the invisible enemy. Historical medical texts, though rudimentary, often list treatments for childhood ailments, underscoring their prevalence and severity. The emotional toll of this constant loss was immense, while societal norms and religious beliefs might have provided frameworks for coping. Seeing infant death as God's will, or as a child returning to heaven, the profound, personal grief of a mother losing her child is timeless and universal. Imagine naming your child, holding them, feeling their tiny grip, only to bury them a short time later. Many mothers would experience this loss multiple times throughout their childbearing years. Each new pregnancy, while a source of hope for a future, was also a source of intense anxiety. Knowing the odds were stacked against the infant's survival, this constant cycle of hope, birth, fear, and often profound grief defined the emotional landscape of motherhood. A mother might deliberately delay forming too deep a bond with a newborn, perhaps as a subconscious protective mechanism, though sources from the period indicate strong maternal love and attachment, making the losses all the more poignant. Furthermore, the lack of understanding about infant care as a specialized field meant that even well-intentioned practices could be harmful. For example, swaddling practices, while intended to provide warmth and security, could restrict movement and hygiene. Limited knowledge of appropriate weaning foods could lead to malnutrition or the introduction of contaminants. The sheer physical demands placed on mothers, who were often back to arduous labor within days of childbirth, meant that exhaustion could compromise their ability to provide consistent, vigilant care, though their dedication was unwavering. Records from family histories, where they exist, often show lists of children born, with several marked as having died in infancy or early childhood, a stark testament to the fragility of young life. For mothers in 970, life was a continuous battle against the forces of illness and death, with their infants being the primary casualties. The experience of motherhood was thus one of profound love, interwoven with perpetual anxiety, a constant negotiation with loss, and an enduring testament to the human capacity for resilience in the face of unimaginable heartbreak.